Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, The State of the Business Analysis Profession in the Digital Age. I'm your host, Mariah Rice, and I work as part of the marketing team here at IIBA. IIBA is an independent, not-for-profit professional association serving the global business analysis community. A recognized thought leader, IIBA is dedicated to elevating the discipline of business analysis. We provide our global community with relevant tools, resources, and networking opportunities. I'm here with your speaker today, Delvin Fletcher. Delvin is the president and CEO at IIBA, an exceptional leader with strong experience and focus. Delvin's background in information systems, accounting, government, and not-for-profits provides him with key insights into the business analysis community. Today, Delvin will discuss with you how digital transformation in the business analysis profession is growing and changing with the marketplace. Our current challenges during a pandemic will have lasting challenges on the world around us. This ultimately means refocusing on business agility and identifying solutions which enable increased velocity of change. This webinar will ask, how do you stay relevant as a business analysis professional? A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the questions tab in your control panel. We will answer some questions at the end of the session as time permits. Today's webinar recording will be available on our IIBA webinar archives page within 7 business days of broadcast. So without further ado, I'll hand off this presentation to Delvin.
Thanks, Mariah, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's really a great pleasure for me to be with you in this webinar today in this kind of virtual world that certainly used to define some of what we did. Now it kind of defines all of what we did. And let me say right at the outset that this is it's a daunting subject. I'm supposed to deliver some wisdom on the state of the business analysis profession in the digital age. In 45 minutes or so, and then take questions. So what I'm going to try to do is share some thinking, some of the research that we've been seeing, some of the areas that are going to be our priorities going forward, a little bit of our reflections on what the COVID-19 pandemic has done to learning and to some of the things that we're trying to do as an organization, and hopefully share a few thoughts in terms of what I think this also means for who we are as professionals in this space inside business analysis. And I hope you find this of value. It's a great pleasure to connect with you. Let me just share a couple of pieces of background. I'm very honored to have joined IIBA as its 4th leader in its 17-year history earlier this year. I had this little thing called COVID come upon us in at least the part of the world where I live about 5 weeks after I came on board. And what that has meant in the last few months is we have really embarked on a 2-part stewardship over the past 3 months that for us as an organization. Part 1, of course, is managing our modest resources. We're a member-supported organization that receives no government or foundation funding. We kind of live and die on the basis of each of you and your commitment to what we're trying to do from a membership standpoint and what we're trying to do from a certification standpoint. So we've obviously spent some time this year in the early part of the pandemic and its impact on business, ensuring that we could stay healthy, ensuring that we could continue to support each of you as members and try also to encourage continued work in the areas that we care about. And I'm pleased to report that we are in good shape. We've seen some modest growth in a few areas this year, which is very encouraging. We have managed our financial affairs prudently, and we're not going away because of COVID, which is obviously an important thing and an important foundation in terms of what we're trying to be as an organization. And then really part 2 of this is trying to figure out what we can do to support our members and stakeholders as they transition to remote work, as their work becomes different, more focused, more urgent, things like that. And we've done a lot of that within our membership over the last few months, particularly trying to provide support in the areas that we can contribute to. And probably now, as we kind of approach the mid-year and this pandemic is continuing in varying levels of intensity in varying parts of the world, it will not finish quickly, probably anywhere with a few exceptions, and there's certainly going to be implications to it both permanently and for sure in the next 6 to 12 months across most countries in the world. So what we're trying to do now is move to kind of part 3 of the stewardship of what we're trying to do as an organization, looking at how our world is changing, how we can support you more creatively and effectively going forward. And I want to take a few minutes to talk about some of the trends that we're seeing, some of the learnings that we are being exposed to, and some of the actions that we are considering working on going forward. 2 big subjects I want to talk about first, and this one's kind of interesting. Probably the only way to look at this is talk in terms of massive growth. About 1.25 years ago, we looked at the business analysis profession, kind of using LinkedIn as a proxy for interest and engagement, and using the metric of people noting business analysis as a skill or a part of their experience. There were just under 18 million people that identified that across the global LinkedIn community. That number today is north of 23 million people. So we are seeing massive interest, engagement, growth within that sort of general category, which of course can spread across a whole range of organizational roles. We have now in the neighborhood of 10 million people who have the title business analyst globally, and around 4.5 million people who have the title senior business analyst. So the profession itself is going through massive growth, massive breadth, diversification, interest. And the other thing that's really interesting about this, as I move on to the next slide, is as we think internally and as we look at the feedback in terms of our work as an association, we're also seeing, in addition to that growth, a huge diversity of where business analysis is finding its way into roles within organizations and governments and institutions and academia. And there's really, I'm not going to take the time to kind of go through this, but we've been monitoring this for a few years now, and we continue to see an active diversification of business analysis and work. In fact, as you can tell from the numbers on the previous slide, there are way more people who identify with business analysis who don't call themselves business analysts. And a lot of it is, and part of our tension going forward as an organization is trying to speak to kind of that group that many of you are in, that identifies with sort of the science and the profession, but also work with a lot of people who have roles that have intimate requirements for business analysis skills, but are called all kinds of other things, all the way from data analytics to people involved in the agile community in various roles to more sort of technical IT-oriented thinking. One of the reasons, by the way, that in 2018 because of this, we made a decision to introduce an initial portfolio of specialty certifications. We started with an agile analysis certification in 2018, and then in 2019, a business data analytics certification, and now in the early part of 2020, a cybersecurity analysis certification. It was because we wanted to allocate some of our resources to providing a little bit deeper, still kind of business analysis focused perspective on some areas that are hugely important in the world that we're now in. And we are considering potentially doing some more work in that same specialty area going forward. A lot of our plans obviously have been slowed down a little bit because of COVID and the need to manage our resources wisely this year. But in the years ahead, this will still be an area that we're going to look at in terms of where it makes sense for us to contribute to a little bit of the specialization that so many of you are involved in terms of the nature of your work. So that's really kind of the big context that we are seeing huge growth. Almost every day there's a new variant on what business analysis can do, where it can apply, how it can help in terms of organizational and institutional settings, as well as this huge diversity in terms of the work and where it finds its way into organizations. Now we have 2020, and we get this storm, I guess, for lack of a better term. Digital transformation met COVID-19 and then was kind of joined by a very strong call to action on purpose and values, all in 6 months. In fact, all in about 4.5 months in most parts of the world. Interestingly, in the middle of this, and we don't think this is coincidental, we've never seen the level of interest in IIBA that we've seen in the last 60 days. In April of this year, we set an all-time record for new visitors to our website, iiba.org. And then in May, we blew that record away with a new one. And I think there's a lot of things about this interest that we are trying to understand and respond well to. But one thing we do believe strongly is that each of you who work in this profession has something to contribute to the times that we are now in. And we're also seeing a lot of indicators that this growing band of practitioners that we are striving to serve is and can respond well to the felt needs that are now unfolding in so many organizations right now. So let me move on. I was looking for sort of some perspective on this and came across this in one of the sources that I read extensively, which is some of McKinsey's writing. And I want to read this to you in its entirety. It's a bit of a long quote, but I think it kind of captures the time we're in probably more than almost anything I've read in the last few weeks. Amid the fear and uncertainty, people are energized as companies make good on purpose statements, eliminate bureaucracy, empower previously untested leaders with big responsibilities, and turbocharge decision making. Organizations felt too bureaucratic, too insular, too inflexible, too slow, too complicated, and often more focused on profit than on people. The COVID-19 pandemic and resulting economic shock have changed none of these things, and at the same time have changed everything. Inertia is clearly riskier than action right now, so companies are mobilizing to address the immediate threat in ways they may have struggled to when taking on more abstract challenges, such as digital technology or automation or artificial intelligence, all of whom still loom, by the way. Bold experiments and new ways of working are now everyone's business. Will the new mindsets become behaviors that stick? This is the crucial set of questions that I want to kind of unpack a little bit as we move forward. We don't know. I don't know. Did it take a pandemic for organizations to focus on change that matters? Too soon to say. It'll be really, really interesting to see 6, 12, 24 months from now, whether this opportunistic period that many organizations feel like they are in actually does become the catalyst for long-term change, or whether this becomes like certain efforts that have happened in the past around technology, around other aspects of kind of business science, and after a few years, organizations and people move on and start working on other skills. We do have a perspective, by the way, maybe not surprisingly, about where business analysis fits into this context, and I do want to talk a little bit about that next, because I think, you know, that really brings us to the so what question, which is, what does all of this mean? And let me be the first to say, I don't know what all of it means. We're still figuring this out. We're still learning. We're still adjusting. We have a lot of work to do as an organization that we're energized by, and we want to dig into as our resources allow us to in the months and years ahead. But there's big parts of this that we don't understand, that we're still trying to figure out, and that we're going to be relying on a lot of our community and members and chapters and other stakeholders to help guide us in the months and years ahead in terms of shifts in terms of our work and the kinds of things that we work on. But I do think there are 3 themes that are increasingly powerful, and these lots of wiser people than I are talking about them and unpacking them and drawing learnings out of them. And I want to touch a little bit on what we think they mean for the profession that we try to work in and represent. And I've described them here as pressure points because I think each of them acts as a point of pressure on who we are, how we work in the organizations that we find ourselves part of, whatever they may be. I think other writers and thinkers will talk about them in terms of imperatives or calls to action or things like that. For me, this is about what we do with the pressure, and I'll kind of come back to that at the very end of this presentation. But I think these 3 things are probably as good a summary as I've found in terms of what's really going on. The first is culture and how business operates. The second is education and how learning changes. And the third is digital and how transformation evolves. And I think in particular, one of the wise leaders that I had the privilege to work for years ago taught me the difference between balance and tension. And he said at the time, you know, we all live in this kind of ideal world, if we're not careful, that says when there's pressure, when things are coming to bear on us, we think the objective is balance, try to make them perfect in some kind of equilibrium. And he said, I would suggest to you that that's not possible for most things, for most people, for most roles, for most organizations. Balance is not the objective, because if you chase balance, you kind of never get there and you waste a lot of time and energy. He said, I'd suggest to you that the better metaphor to think about is tension, that these pressure points are going to sit in tension. None of them are going to go away, and there will probably be more, and there's probably more that we could talk about even in the context of this conversation today. But the goal isn't to achieve some perfect balance here or some perfect balance between these pressure points and my work, whatever it may be. The goal is to keep these in tension in a way that is healthy, where one doesn't carry me too far off track, or where the collective pressure of all of them doesn't overwhelm whatever I'm trying to do. And obviously, even in this audience that we're talking to right now, there's a huge group of you, ranging from people with tremendous wisdom to bring into this area who've been practicing in this space for many, many years, and probably others who are just trying to understand what it may bring to your life in the early stages of your career. And there's, some of you could do much better lectures than I'm going to do on what all of this means. And I appreciate that. Those are also voices we need to hear. But for those of you who may be new to this, let me kind of unpack this a little bit in terms of where I think we as a profession are going and some of the impacts that I think are going to come out of these three pressure points. The first is this one, culture and how business operates. Think about the old normal in your work for a minute. For a lot of the kinds of things that you do, you've got a typical scenario. You get a bunch of people in a room with a whiteboard and you start engaging. You start reading body language. You're scrawling ideas on a whiteboard. You're rubbing them out and replacing them with new ideas. You're drawing words, diagrams, but your interaction is not just that tool that you're using, whatever it may be. Your interaction is the sum of all of that, the body language, the responses, the dialogue, the people talking over each other. And your objective is to organize that into an outcome, into action items, into next steps, into accountabilities, into schedules, into consensus, into resolving conflict, into trying to understand what the next steps are for whatever the area is that you happen to be working in. There were always remote people in those conversations for many organizations, or people you needed to update on what happened and what happens next. So in some ways, this hasn't changed, but in other ways, as McKinsey said, it has changed. Half of this has now changed. That body language is a whole lot harder to read, right? That interaction that is human, sure, we can do that in virtual whiteboards, but virtual whiteboards are not the same as sitting in a room, hashing out an idea, trying to work on some consensus. And I think what this now does is it creates an opportunity for us to explore a couple things a little bit more deeply than maybe we had to before. A lot of the work that I have done over my career and a lot of the work that I'm sure you are involved in can really be broken down into actually another set of tensions, which is trying to guide a team or an organization or a strategy or a decision process really around these 3 points: what we have done, what we can do, what we should do. This principle applies to transformation work. It applies to technology implementation. It applies to pivots in terms of product strategy or go-to-market strategy. It applies to institutional objectives. It's sure a little bit simplified, but I think as a high-level view of what our work is like, it has certainly served me well as sort of a simple construct to think in terms of my work over the kinds of roles I've had in the past. But now we kind of have a question that I think is more acute even than it probably was beforehand, and that is, what are we going to do with this? Because what I've seen over the years is that the comfort zone of work, especially of the kind of work that we do as business analysts, is kind of somewhere between what we have done and what we should do. The easiest place to be is trying to replicate what we have done. And lots of organizations do a very, very good job of trying to figure out how to do that. And then they wonder why their change or their transformation didn't have nearly the impact that they thought it was going to have, or nearly the ROI for the investment that they made in it. And certain organizations obviously do a much better job of understanding what they should do or what they can do as part of that. But if there's a criticism of our work over the years, it's probably that at times we just get too comfortable. And the easiest place to be comfortable in an organization is by digging a little too deeply, a little too comprehensively into the work that we have all done. I'd suggest to you that, kind of for all time, but especially now, the effectiveness zone is figuring out how to take your experience, your tools, the mechanisms that you have to operate, and move them as radically over to this other pair of axes as you can. Because effectiveness really comes from getting the right tension between what we can do and what we should do. And I think that what COVID is doing to a lot of our work and a lot of the organizations that we work in is it's making that much, much more visible. It's making those decisions much, much more acute. In certain cases, with certain industry sectors that some of you are in, that's going to be the difference between whether or not the organization you work for survives or doesn't survive in the future. In other organizations, it's not going to be that significant. But I think the principle increasingly is actually going to be that same kind of thing. So my big encouragement here is, in whatever work you do, however you do it, with whatever tool sets and experience and expertise you bring to the table, think about where and how you can move that. Because organizations, certainly the thought leaders that are weighing in on this, are saying pretty unequivocally that organizations that focus on what they used to do in the comfort zone of their business model, and even the comfort zone of some of what they thought was transformative a year ago, are going to be the ones that are in the most difficulty as the world unfolds going forward. And organizations that figure out how to get that tension over to this kind of left side of this diagram and hold it in a way that is positive are going to figure out how to adapt, how to adjust, how to be agile, how to be resilient, all the words that you hear talked about, and a few that we'll touch on in a minute. And I think what that really means is thinking about a couple things. One of the most important ones, and there's a couple of writers, one from Brown University, one from Harvard, that have informed some of my thinking over the last few weeks as I've looked at a few learned writers. One of them raises a question I think is very important, which is this one, the first one: am I working on a disaster or a crisis, or both? Because treating a disaster like a crisis can be just as damaging as treating a crisis like a disaster. A disaster fundamentally is something that I cannot control. And parts of COVID for many organizations is a disaster. But a crisis is a key decision making. It's a point I'm at. It's an inflection point. It's a fork in the road in some vernaculars that says I can go this way or I can go the other way. If I treat a disaster like a crisis, I'm going to miss opportunity. If I treat a crisis like a disaster, I'm probably going to do things that I might necessarily not need to and I might regret, particularly taking action too quickly or too dramatically than I might find isn't necessarily the case. And I think that kind of leads to the second point in terms of the relevance for our work, which is what has actually changed. Is it the what or is it the how? And I think depending on who you are, what organizations you work for, and where they are in terms of the journey that many of us are now going through, sometimes the questions are the how, but sometimes they are the what. Sometimes they probably are a combination of both. But my encouragement there is to make sure you don't confuse those two in your work as well, because the how is about method. It's about adapting skills. It's about creativity. It's about taking the tool set that I know and have worked with and have experience with and tuning it to the needs of the moment, like the example we talked about a minute ago. But the what is a more fundamental question, because the what may mean my organization needs to change. And it needs to change in terms of how it approaches the market, how it executes within that market, many of those kinds of things. And that really kind of leads to this other point that we're hearing a lot of people talk about, which is my business still linear? In other words, am I a widget company that operates on a globally optimized, cost optimized supply chain? Or is that now the world that I can no longer afford to be in, because that supply chain has now become a risk or a crisis or a disaster, a little in certain cases, right? So I think part of it is thinking and understanding where the context of the projects and the change that you are trying to facilitate and work in is it impacting work that is fundamental to your business? And is your business now more event driven? Is it project driven? Is it about getting change done? And there's lots of stories out there, and I'd encourage you to read them in terms of organizations that in the heat of the crisis of COVID took a hard look at who they were and decided that this was the opportunity that they had to pivot or that they had nothing to lose. And I think that's really what leads to these other 3 points, which is, I think for those of us practicing within business analysis, it's so critical for us to understand where we can be guides around embracing uncertainty, around teaching what resilience means, around risk and not trying, helping guide organizations through the risk of not trying new things. Because a lot of our work in the past has been managing the risk of what we're trying to do, as opposed to encouraging jumping into kind of those unknown areas. And I think there's obviously some other areas that some of you work in very actively. How is technology leveraging customer intimacy, or how is technology taking away from customer intimacy? In your work, it's so important to understand the difference between the two of those. And really a lot of this comes down to can you help your organization step outside its comfort zone? And that really kind of brings us to the 3rd point, which is if some parts of this relate to the organizations that you find yourselves in, then so what? What does that actually mean? And how can we learn from kind of this next step, which is education and how learning changes? You don't need me to tell you that learning is now disrupted. We think that there are 2 dimensions to learning going forward, and both of them are going to be so critical to how business analysis functions in the marketplaces that we find ourselves in. The first one is this one, how I learn. At a summary level, our view of this is actually pretty straightforward. We really believe that that credentials and getting blocks of learning into your journey as a worker of some kind in organizations of various kinds is so important. It's one of the core principles that IIBA was founded on, and it's one that we continue to believe is crucial to success. It's one of the reasons that we invest a meaningful portion of our revenue in developing and maintaining a thorough, academically rigorous certification program that is fully virtual, does not depend on classrooms, and can be remotely proctored. We believe that part of this learning journey for business analysis really is around credential. And by the way, there's some immensely talented thinkers who are tackling this subject in the broader setting of academic institutions and how they need to evolve. One of the ones I read actively is Scott Galloway, who's a bit of a provocative writer. He works out of the Stern School at New York University and publishes a blog and a few other things that are really designed to challenge the status quo and provide some insight into how some of the larger and kind of globally known education institutions are starting to deal with this, or what he thinks they should be dealing about it. So I'd encourage you to take a look at him and similar writers in terms of getting some deeper insight into how learning takes place. And by the way, that's very important in the work that we're operating in, because as we've looked at the profession of business analysis, we really think increasingly that the journey of our profession really falls around a couple of axes. The first is what we'd call career events, and getting certified is an important one because a lot of times it's the starting point of maturity. And there's lots of other things that kind of enter around it: changing jobs, changing organizations, deciding to get more certified, or dealing with higher education beyond some initial things, promotions, leadership. And what we're finding increasingly is in probably 10, 20, 30 years ago, this progression was much more linear. It was a set of flows where you could kind of predict where you started and where you wanted to ideally end up. Now, what we're seeing more and more of, it's not that way at all. We're seeing lots of turns, lots of twists, lots of going back and moving to another position, and then going back and adding another certification or another piece of learning or another degree. And it's a much more fluid, a much more organic, a much more iterative process. But inside that, we also see another set of themes, which is career phases are increasingly going through really 4 stages. And this might be more linear. I'm not sure. We're still kind of unpacking what this needs to mean for us as an organization. But some of the research that we've been doing recently really frames itself around these 4 things, which is, in the early stage of my career, a lot of times I'm focused on developing skills. That's partly why certification is so critically important. As I get a little farther on into my career, I really want to focus on developing experience, because it's experience that allows me to move up in terms of roles, to take on more responsibility, to lead teams, to manage complex projects, to contribute to major transformation efforts. And then for a lot of you, as you move past that, you want to start developing expertise, which is the ability to be an authority on something, the ability to have deep skills in a particular area. And as you get sort of towards the end of your career, a lot of times what an organization wants is wisdom. They know that if they hire you, they're going to get skills, experience, and expertise. What they're looking for is the ability to take all of those things and synthesize them into perspective, into guidance, into how complex programs or projects can be sorted out, into how complex change can be navigated, into the human elements of organizational transformation or digital transformation. So this framework that has come out of some research we've done recently is an area that we're going to be taking and starting to apply a little bit more actively to our journey as an organization. And it really has a couple of other implications that come out of it that I want to share with you around the whole learning axis. The first is what we're finding, and again, some of you will know this very well from your own experience or your own teaching or learning, is that there's really three dimensions to this learning. There's a social dimension, there's a formal dimension, there's an experiential dimension. For a lot of people in the early parts of their career, that formal part is focused on structured and sequenced training based on standardized knowledge. And then as you move forward, you kind of add the other two areas in, which is you want informal learning, you want peer-to-peer interactions, you want community, you want abilities to tap into things that are not as structured as maybe they were in the early part of your career. And then as that moves forward, you want to see experiential learning, which is where some of the things that we're working on directionally will start to come to the table as well. But it's not enough to have formal skills and have a community that I can work with. I also want to understand what other people have done, particularly where they made mistakes, where they learned, where they were able to impact change, maybe beyond just the structure of the learning that they were bringing to the table. What we're increasingly seeing is that those three elements are applying in various ways to the progression of BA careers. That in the early part of a career, when skills is a primary focus, then the weight is going to be on formal learning until some skills have been mastered. As you move more into the experience stage, then experience and the expertise stage, then experiential learning and to some degree social learning come more to the table. And as you get towards the sort of the wisdom stage of learning, which is of course what many of us aspire to, then formal learning becomes less of a factor because you're way past that. You've understood those concepts, you've acquired that degree, you hold that certification, and you also now have experience to bring to the table. You're a teacher instead of a learner. So a lot of it now is the community, which is how can I share what I have learned? How can I share the good things and the things that aren't so good with others? How can I mentor? How can I bring some of that to the table in such a way that helps others who are at a different stage of their career? So before I move on, really that kind of content and learning for us, some of this has been inside of who we are and what we've tried to be as an organization in all of our time together. Some of it is going to help shape a lot of what we try to approach going forward. But how I learn really in the context of how business is changing is really only half the equation, because the other half of the equation is how I teach. And almost all of us in one way or another, whether we think about it this way or not, are teaching, right? We stand up in front of a room and we try to elicit requirements. We're teaching both methodology and outcome to the people in the organization that we might need to be a part of. And I don't have a perfect model here to share some of what my thoughts are on how we teach, but I do have two really interesting quotes that I want to share with you, partly because they're very impactful and have made me think a little bit about my own learning and my own teaching, which is Guy Schoen, who some of you will know of, is a well-known broadcaster in the UK, did a seminar with us a couple of weeks ago, and when I was listening to him, I made some notes of a few things he said. This was one of them. He said, "Stop educating, start learning." And his context there was really, really important. He was asking questions like, do you know where your business is going? Do you know what your leaders are grappling with? Do you know what the issues are that are in front of your board or your government? And now, before you teach them how you've got a technique that will help, think about what the right technique is. How do my techniques apply to this? Not because I'm trying to create expertise in method, but because I need to create effectiveness and outcome. And my methods, my portfolio of methods, my skills, my experience, depending on where I am in terms of my journey as a business analysis practitioner, they're still all there. The question now is, how do I bring them to the table in creative, effective, outcome-oriented ways? And McKinsey talked in the same article I referenced earlier about some of this as well. And they said, organizations that equip their leaders with the meta skill of learning, how to learn, how to adapt, how to change quickly, will be better able to thrive and succeed. And I think part of what all of us can learn from in both of these things is the context of our work is now so important, maybe in a lot of cases more important than it was even a year ago, because a year ago this was a transformation project in order to drive market share in a particular business. Today, it's a pivot on how we engage with our market in order to survive as the company we want to try and be in the future, right? The stakes are now much, much higher. And I think Guy in particular sort of really drilled this point home to us in terms of saying, you've got to understand the context of your work. You've got to think about it. You've got to develop a little bit of expertise, a little bit of muscle in terms of the organizations that you are working for, what they are going through, what they are trying to do in order to do your best work. And I think that kind of leads to a few points that I'm going to go through very quickly before I move on, which is really asking myself and ourselves, where am I on that learning continuum? What is my teaching style? Do I have a learning teaching style, or do I have an instructional style? I think when we're at our best, we're helping our teams and the organizations we work with learn how to apply method. When we're not at our best, we're teaching them and to some degree holding them accountable for the skills that we kind of already have. And I think inside that, we're also seeing these other things going on. The disaster crisis motif comes to bear here as well. And there's all kinds of people who are writing about the need for speed, the need for agility. And as I said earlier, even inside learning, part of it is this kind of tension that I think between what and how, between method and outcome. There's probably lots of other examples that we can unpack with a little bit more time. But my real encouragement to you in all of this is to take that thought process, whatever parts of it might relate to your world, and think a little bit about in terms of how this could help you be better, a little bit more effective, a little bit more impactful in the work that you're doing within your particular organizational setting. Let's talk briefly about the third point. And this subject also has had lots of airplay. It's not new. You can argue that there are people out there like Thomas Davenport or Chris Anderson come to mind, and others that have been talking and writing about this for 15 years or longer. Been a ton of work done in the last decade. I'm sure that many of you on this webinar are actively involved in digital transformation projects. And I think that one of the points that I found instructive in this was, and it actually came out of Rich Lesser and Martin Reeves at Boston Consulting Group. They argue that digital is no longer discretionary nor self-paced, nor is it as much about technology as we might have thought it was. Their quote's kind of interesting. Businesses and consumers have essentially been given a massive opportunity to try out and get accustomed to digital shopping, working, and collaboration. Think about what we're doing right now. If we had tried to make this an organizational imperative a year ago, it probably wouldn't have worked. We would have had all kinds of people, quite rightly, challenge us on the fact that this couldn't accomplish much, that it was a shadow of what sitting in a physical room, in a physical space as much as possible, as much as our circumstances allow, is going to be a much more effective way of getting certain things done. And that's not, by the way, wrong. There's a lot of wisdom and experience in that. The problem now is it's also not a choice for the vast majority of us talking together today, right? So I think that principle itself is now really, really interesting to think about as we look at digital transformation going forward. And I think it's going to create some interesting tests, interesting questions, interesting challenges. One of them is around this resilience brittle thing, which a lot of writers are talking about, which is thinking about the organization you're working in and asking yourself the question, do I actually have something that's resilient, or do I have something that's a little bit brittle? One of the best metaphors that somebody gave me once to kind of think about that is a big pile of concrete called the CN Tower that happens to be about 40 miles east of where I live in the center of Toronto. And the CN Tower, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a little over 550 meters high, around 1,500 feet, until it was surpassed by the Burj Khalifa in 2007. It was the tallest freestanding structure in the world, and it's a communications hub and a few other things. Somebody told me once that that building, which I don't even want to tell you how many 1,000 pounds of concrete are in it, that building is designed to flex 6 feet off its axis at the top in a hurricane force wind, which of course would be terrifying if you were up there, and I'm sure you wouldn't be allowed to. But if you can imagine being 1,500 feet up in the air, moving back and forth, 6 feet one way, 6 feet the other, you know, it's scary in human terms, but it illustrates what the engineers and the designers and the architects of that building were thinking about when they put something up in the air, I think 35 or 40 years ago when it was built, which is they realized in technical terms that that structure had to be resilient. It had to have flex built into it. It had to be able to move. Because of course, obviously, if it didn't, and some of you will know this way better than I, there would be all kinds of consequences. But I think that principle is what we are seeing increasingly work its way into the business organizations that we are in, whether it's their supply chain or their go-to-market strategy or how they engage with customers or how they execute on projects or how they build outcomes. It's this concept of saying, am I working on something that is resilient that I thought a year ago was pretty fundamental to my work, or is it brittle? And if it's brittle, what do I have to do in order to make it more resilient? Because if there's one thing that COVID is teaching us, it's the brittle is not going to work, and it's not going to work for the vast majority of us. I think there's some other questions that are worth reflecting on, which is, you know, am I working on a digital outcome or am I managing digital risk? We're thinking a little bit more about business risk, because in this idea of saying, hey, I've got an opportunity to do things that might have been hard a year ago, there's also risk, which is I can't go too far down there, or I'm going to jeopardize value propositions in organizations, or I'm going to jeopardize the successful completion of big change initiatives or big technology projects. So a lot of it's also thinking about whether or not you're working in outcome or risk. And maybe for some of you, it's both, or that it starts with outcome and then it becomes a risk conversation, because I think which parts of the tool set you bring to the table are going to change depending on what focus that is. I also think there's sort of this old way, new way thing going on, which is, you know, old transformation projects were really about kind of this premise that says, I'm going to be part of a big change. I'm going to guide it, lead it, participate in it, map its outcomes out, do all those kinds of things. There's going to be a lot of upheaval. And then when we're done, we'll have stability, we'll have success, we'll have market share, we'll have penetration into whatever vertical space we're trying to accomplish, or we'll have efficiency, or we'll have cost reduction, whatever the outcomes might be. The problem now is that I think we're seeing a new way, which is that those big changes and big upheavals have to happen more quickly. They have to have a lot more dimensions to them. It can't just be about reducing cost. It can't just be about implementing new technology, because I now have social relevance, I have purpose, I have agility, I have robustness, I have flex, I have options, I have redundancy, I have all of those things coming to the table. And I think one of the biggest imperatives that we can contribute to, and I think it's one of the reasons that we're seeing so much growth in the business analysis profession, is the red flags, which is we're in a unique position, particularly if we understand business, we understand the organizations we work for, maybe a little bit more intimately than we used to. We understand that sort of cadence that they need to work on. And we have this huge opportunity to be the early warning system that says, hey, that's a great idea, and I love the fact that we can experiment there. But have you thought about this? What happens to this? Have we thought through the implications to this? You know, and I think it's that skill set, honing those skills to say, hey, I'm in a position where I've got an understanding of how, say, a customer service process works. So I can raise the red flags and provide some guidance about where this could actually be innovative, could be valuable, could be helpful, but also on the other side of it, where that could get us into trouble because we haven't thought through the implications of it, or we haven't thought through some of where that may sort of look like in terms of our future as a business. And I'd really encourage you, as much as you're involved in those kinds of things, to kind of think about that kind of context in your work. That really brings us to kind of a final slide, and I'll come back to this pressure point, which is I think the thing that we're learning as an organization and that we are going to try and bring to the table in terms of our work in the months and years ahead is that these pressure points, even though they're much more acute now, are likely not going to go away. In fact, I'm not sure that the pace at which they're going to influence our work is actually going to slow down. We may see some cycles over the next little while, depending on what happens. But I think these three things are going to continue to evolve. They're going to continue to transform. And I think part of it is what are we going to take away from this as practitioners? And some of it's a lot of the things that I've talked about already in terms of tension versus balance and these ideas around resilience and adaptability and urgency and controlled experimentation. So my encouragement to you would be to sort of think about how this may apply in your setting. And some of that may just not be the context in which I've been sharing with you. I was talking to Jazz Full, who leads our intellectual property and sort of product team at IIBA yesterday or the day before about sort of how this kind of comes together. And he said, you know what? He said, there's an interesting answer to your question just off the top of my mind. He said, we have our members have access to a document called the Business Analysis Competency Model, which is something we've worked on with a lot of the leading practitioners in the field that kind of maps out some career journeys, maps out skill sets, maps out some of those things I talked about a little bit earlier in an organized fashion in the business analysis context. And he said, you know, there's a section in there called adaptability. It was written, I think, last edited in 2017, long before COVID, but I read it last night and I can tell you it still applies. That idea of how we take our methods and our tool sets and how we apply them to these moments that we are now in is still fundamentally about having that grounding in skill or experience or wisdom or knowledge or failure or success, and saying, okay, what parts of that can I draw out? What parts of that can I adjust in terms of the mode? Because in most of the world, I'm not sitting in a room with my team building relationships and trying to get things done. What parts of that can I now adapt to the moment that I find myself in, whether it's a new business objective, whether it's a crisis, whether it's a disaster, or whether it's a change that we now believe has greater urgency associated with it, and we've got to do it in 3 months instead of 2 years, and try to take some of those ideas and bring them to bear on the work that you're doing. You know, and a lot of this, and my last comment was kind of the one Jazz and I were playing around with a little bit in our thinking, was the opportunity more than anything else is we can be the voice in our work of controlled experimentation. What about this? What if you tried this? What if we do this for a month and then see what happens? What if we measure the results and if it's not having the kind of impact that we thought it was going to have, we can move on. There's a lot of negative things about COVID, and there's a lot of structural things that are hugely negative for various organizations and various people. We fully get that. But there's also a bit of opportunity in some cases here, which is we can do things now more quickly. We can probably even fail a little bit in ways that we couldn't a while ago because change creates a culture in which failure is going to be tolerated a little bit more, experimentation is going to be tolerated a little bit more for a period of time. And that might not be long, by the way. It might just be this year, it might just be this month. So part of it is sort of saying, how in my work can I take some of those concepts, what I know, what I'm learning, the skills that I'm acquiring, and bring them to the table in a way that I can bring some value to these kinds of conversations that I'm involved in the work that I do inside the business analysis space. So I appreciate your time in working through this with me. There's lots of things that we're going to be trying to unpack in this going forward. There's some impacts that we think are going to be important for how we work in the months and years ahead as IIBA. But I appreciate your time today. We've got a few minutes left, I know, so Mariah, I'm going to turn it back to you and see if there's a couple of questions that we can unpack before we close.
Thanks, Delvin. That was an insightful presentation. I think we learned a lot about the state of a business analysis and the ways of working and how they've changed, and our 3 acute pressure points. So we will open up the floor for a Q&A. So if anyone with a question could put their question in the questions tab in the control panel, that would be perfect. I see we have a few questions trickling in already. So I'm going to start with a question from Ben here. Do you find that new business analysis grads are struggling in industry-specific parts of the market. Has that been exacerbated at all by COVID? What recommendations would you give to him? I think your slide 17 or 15 might speak to that.
Great question. Thank you for that. And it's a big question that we could spend a lot of time talking on. I think there is a part of that that is true. I think that I remember when I was new into this field, that I think the temptation that you have to work against is finding the best method, because there's a lot of method that you can use, and even in our work, we have dozens, in some cases multiple dozens of methodologies or practitioner type things. I think the key is to come back to one of the points that some of the people I've been reading are saying, which is figure out the intersection between business need and method, as opposed to trying to be an expert at method. There's a role for method expertise. But especially, I think, early on in your career and in a lot of the industries right now, where your value is going to come because you figure out enough about your business, the project that you're working on, or the change that you're working on, and the right methods. I don't think it's an easy thing to do, by the way, because what COVID is doing is accelerating all of that, the rate of change of all of that, so that what seems like a really good idea today, like, let's change our customer service engagement process, 2 weeks from now could be a different imperative because something else has happened in our marketplace. Like we just lost that customer segment because of something that actually truly was a disaster beyond our control. So my encouragement there would be make sure that you have enough understanding about your business so that you can choose the methods that are at the table, and also be willing to kind of experiment a little bit with that and say, hey, I know we used to do it this way. What if we try and do it this way? Because I think that might get us to answers quicker, might get us to an outcome that's crisper, might get us to something that, say, has a little bit less business risk in it.
Thanks, Delvin. I'll take this next question from Sean. Where does Agile fit in our current digital transformation?
That's also a loaded question. I think there's a lot of answers to it. We believe Agile is, as a core science, a kind of a fundamental extension of a lot of the things that we have tried to do as an organization around business analysis. That's why we released an Agile extension to the BA BOK, which is kind of our core body of knowledge. So I think there's a huge role for Agile in certain parts of the work that we're doing. And I think our perspective on it from IIBA standpoint is we're not trying to become the authority on Agile science. There's lots of organizations out there that are doing a really, really good job of building that out and teaching that and building the equipping part of that. We believe that there's a strong role for business analysis as a support to critical parts of Agile from a methodology standpoint, which is kind of what's embodied in our Agile extension and in the certification that we released in 2018. I think that what we're also seeing, though, is that organizations working in Agile are seeing, just like they've seen in other methodologies, huge ranges of success to not so much success. Because at the end of the day, Agile is a powerful set of tools that can be applied to a range of different problems and business outcomes and business opportunities. But at the end of the day, it still requires, at a number of key points inside the Agile process, strong, focused business analysis. In some cases, that business analysis needs to be adopted to the methodology. In some cases, that business analysis is really just focused on making sure we understand what we are trying to do, or what we're trying to change, or what we're trying to build, or what we're trying to visualize, so that the Agile tool set itself can be brought to the table and used to kind of marry up with that. So I think sometimes we see business analysis as the foundation of good Agile. In other cases, we see it as some processes that will partner with Agile as a methodology. But I think both of these conversations are going to be active together for a long, long time.
Thanks, Delvin. So I'll move on to a question from Jadish here. So what skills or things a business analysis needs to focus on in this current scenario? What are some areas that you think that should be a focus?
I think there's a few that come to mind. I think understanding, probably for many of you, if I'm kind of guessing correctly. Your work may not have changed. You may still be on a large initiative. You may still be trying to understand some needs. You may still be on framing a technology project. What has changed is the corporate context in which you're working. And that comes back to some of the things I talked about earlier, which is I don't think a lot of method has changed. I don't think a lot of technique has changed. I think the mode in which we can deploy those techniques obviously has changed, because I can't do certain things physically that I used to be able to do. So I think there is some change there that I would really encourage you to think about. But I think the more important one probably is to make sure that you understand the context and the urgency of the work that you're doing. And a lot of that is at the stakeholder, leadership, board, shareholder, vertical industry area that you're working, which is, if you don't typically spend any time thinking about your business in the marketplace, my encouragement would be to put a bit of time into understanding that. Read publicly, read industry, so that you can get a bit of context to your project. Because I think the techniques and the methodologies and the thinking that we've kind of tried to represent for a decade and a half still largely applies. What is changing is the pace, the urgency, the risk factors, am I still doing what I thought I was doing a year ago, or am I now doing that same work but with a slightly critical purpose? Because now I'm protecting a customer base that I used to be just trying to improve the experience of. Now I'm protecting how my supply chain works, because we thought it was great, but now we found out that it's brittle and it needs to be resilient. So I need options. I need the ability to dynamically adjust. So I think it's kind of that's a bit of the what and the how that we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is taking that methodology and just pausing for a minute sometimes, kind of in your own mind figuratively, but maybe also in a meeting, and saying, what has actually changed? Are we still doing the same thing we thought we were doing when we started this project? And by the way, in lots of cases, that may actually be the case. But I think in some parts of the organizations that we work for, that something has changed. And it's really important that we understand what that change is and how it might tune, adjust, impact our experimentation, that kind of thing.
I think your answer kind of leads into a question from Nicole, or at least speaks to it in a lot of ways. Would you say a business analyst persuades or drives the change with stakeholders, or are BAs trying to get them to make a change?
It's a great question. Thanks, Nicole. It probably depends. I think that if you pick up on that comment that Guy Sean was making in his webinar with us, I think what he was really trying to say was there's probably still both of them, but it's the learning that needs to frame what we're doing. I think, we're still teaching because we're the voice of rigor. We're the voice of ensuring that we understand this correctly. And like lots of voices, the voice itself is not the problem. It's pushing the voice too hard. So if the voice of making sure we understand what we're trying to accomplish gets pushed too hard and becomes the voice of ensuring that we understand, or we 100% dot the I's and cross the T's of this particular methodology, then we run the risk of a relevance problem. And that's why kind of the context of what we're doing is really, really important, because if we push too hard on perfect methodology, we run the risk of having a conflict with urgency. But on the other hand, if we're in a risk setting where part of our work is trying to help our organization make sure that they don't go down a path that they might regret, right? I think that it's the nuance of applying those various pressures to the work that I'm doing. And I think my advice to you, kind of as maybe a bad generalization, which of course is tough in this kind of setting, is don't throw out anything you're learning or doing or teaching or trying to bring your organizations through. Just pause a little bit for context and make sure that you've thought a little about why you're doing what you're doing. And that may simply empower you to move on and accelerate it, but it may also empower you a little bit or encourage you to think and move 10 degrees or move 20 degrees, because learning is the posture that almost every organization is now going through. Because a lot of us, we're now learning what has changed and what the impact of that change is to us as organizations. So I think the learning dimension to how we are trying to work, even if it's kind of in the context of teaching, now has become a little bit more important than it was prior to COVID.
Thanks, Delvin. With us almost out of time, this will be my last question for you, and I think you've spoken a lot to this as well. From Chibuzo, for those of us changing careers as a new BA, what do you advise and what would you have for us to be able to acquire that experience in this current COVID situation?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. Part of that is obviously this is what we're trying to do as an organization. Our focus historically is really on this. It's probably another tension if we think about it this way between core equipping skills, which is what we try to do with CBAP and CCBA and ECBA, and now in the last few years taking certain areas of the work that we're operating in and digging into the specialty side of that with the 3 specialty certifications. But I think my encouragement to you is if you're thinking about a career change, understand the business that you're going into and understand the methodologies that are most critical. You know, for example, if it's an organization that builds software, most progressive organizations these days have at least some aspect of agile development inside the methodology. So you're going to find that agile specialization is likely a much more critical thing. If you're working in a traditional, you know, maybe government structured organization that is still in the early stages of digital transformation, then core methodology is probably going to be more important so that you'll have a broad set of skills that you can develop, you know, a lot of what we talk about in our BA block. And then you're equipped to say, okay, in this situation, I think these are the 2 or 3 things that I'm going to bring to the table and help. And in another situation might be a different kind of thing.
Thanks, Delvin, and thank you for all of your insightful answers today. That does wrap up our time for Q&A, and that's it for our webinar today. So
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you to everyone in your thoughtful questions. I'd like to thank Delvin Fletcher for your time and expert insights into the state of business analysis and digital transformation. And thank you to our attendees for being here. We will send a follow-up to you, and please feel free to respond to us with any questions or comments you may have. We'd like to know what kind of webinars you'd like to see from IIBA, and we love your feedback. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.